Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kari. Thanks so much for being here today. Now, I just recently did a recent reads video of everything that I've read so far in 2022, which I'm going to link down below if you're interested. But I haven't told you everything that I read in 2021, so I thought I would do that today, and maybe you can get some recommendations of things to read this year in 2022. I'm going to tell you the top 12 books that I read in 2021. I'm going to start with my favorite book of 2021 and work my way down the list. So my favorite book actually came from reading a book from the Literally Dead book club that's run by Books and Lala, which I'll link down below. And after watching the live show, it was obvious that this book was pretty divisive, that people either really loved it or they didn't like it at all. But I loved it, and it's going to be one of my favorite books of all time, and that's House of Leaves by Mark Z. Danielewski. So this is a horror book, and I started it at night, and I regretted right away that I started reading it at night. I could not continue it. I had to stop reading it and wait until it was light out again. So this book has multiple points of view. One of the main ones is from Johnny Truant, and he just moved into a new apartment complex, into the apartment of an old man that just died, Zampano. And so when Johnny goes into the apartment, he finds a bunch of documents that Zampano left behind. And all of these documents that Zampano left behind are about this documentary called The Navidson Record. And so The Navidson Record is a documentary about this man named Will Navidson. It's about his house, because his house is bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. So this book follows Johnny Truant trying to go through all of Zampano's documents and figure out what the heck was the Navidson Record? Who was Will Navidson? What happened to him? Was this house even real? And try to put these pieces together. This book has a really unique format because it's filled with footnotes, annotations, bizarre letters, and other things. And sometimes the text is even distorted itself. So for example, here we have the story going on up here, but then we have all these annotations down here. And even on the next page, we have the story continuing up here and the annotations continuing down here. But even in the annotations, sometimes they're real annotations from Zampano, and other times the annotations are just musings from Johnny Truant that he's adding. Also, like I said, this book is really famous for having text that goes every which way. So for example, in parts of these texts, they start on a different page previously, and you have to follow that little block of text all the way until it ends, and then you have to go back and start the next block and read that all the way through. Now, while I was reading this, I kept a lot of annotations because I was trying to keep everything straight, and it's like a puzzle that you're trying to figure out. How do all these people, how do all these instances of crazy things happening fit together? And at the same time, you're trying to keep track of the text. So I even have a little annotation right here, and I said, this book is a fucking puzzle. Have to keep track of where you are, much like the house. Now, don't be intimidated by how big this book is. I mean, you can see that it's pretty big. It's over 700 pages, but there are a lot of pages where there's almost nothing on it. It's not truly over 700 pages because there's a lot of pages like this, but the pages that have words on it, like I said, they're kind of all over the place. And towards the end of the book, this isn't a spoiler or anything just because it's at the end of the book, but that's just where it is. There's a letter, and it's kind of like coded, and you have to figure out the code to be able to understand the letter. And so I literally had to write in the margins what the letter actually is as I was deciphering the code. So don't read that. Just glance at it. Don't read that if you don't want spoilers or anything, but just to give you an idea that this book is really just a puzzle that you're trying to fit all these things together to figure out what happened. Now, like I said, I took a lot of annotations while I was reading this because I was trying to figure out myself, and I didn't want to lose anything, and I wanted to make sure that I was making the connections I was supposed to be making. One day while reading this, I actually sat down and read this for nonstop for 6 hours, and it did not feel like 6 hours. Seriously, I'm not lying to you. It felt like 30 minutes max had passed, and when I looked at the clock, it had been 6 hours. So that's really how enthralling the story is, and how captivating it is, and how wrapped up you get into the story trying to figure everything out. So like I said, you shouldn't be intimidated by how big this book is. I agree, it's huge, and it's a little intimidating knowing that all the text is a bit crazy and you really have to be on your toes while you're reading, but really it's really rewarding, and it's so fun to just sit down and get immersed in the story. Like I said, this was my favorite book that I read in 2021. I absolutely loved it. I cannot wait to read it again. I'm trying to put a little time between when I read it and when I read it again because I want to forget as much as possible, so it's like reliving things that happened. So I think maybe next year I'll read it again. Actually, when I finished reading this, I went online and tried to research more about it, which I think is pretty common, and I found out that there's kind of like a companion piece to this book, and the companion piece is called the Whalestoe Papers. Now, I'm not going to say too much about what this is, what the Whalestoe Papers are, because that would kind of get into spoiler territory for the original book, but just know if you've read House of Leaves and you loved it and you want even more, go ahead and get a copy of this because it's in addition to the Whalestoe letters at the end of the book. I haven't read this yet, but I think I'm going to read it after my second reading of House of Leaves as a whole. Next, my second favorite book of 2021 was The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This book is from the first-person perspective of Richard Papin, who was just recently accepted to a really prestigious university in Vermont. He ends up being able to integrate this really small and elite group of students who study Greek with their professor Julian Morrow. Now this group of students, they're kind of pretentious and think a lot of themselves, and so they don't accept Richard right away. But eventually they end up being really impressed by his knowledge of Greek literature, and they accept him as one of their own. So this is like the grandfather of dark academia. If you're interested in dark academia, you have to read The Secret History. I mean, this is like the foundational text of dark academia, because it really examines kind of the negative side of elite universities and elite education. Because at the very opening of the book, this isn't a spoiler, it's literally the first chapter of the book, we understand that one of the friends in the small elite group has been killed. And so after we find out that this group member dies, the whole story rewinds and we kind of work our way back to that point in time and figure out what led to this. Donna Tartt's writing is absolutely beautiful. It's so lyrical. It makes kind of the terrible things and the terrible choices that these students are doing sound incredibly beautiful. This is just over 600 pages, and it's the first time that I actually wish that a book was longer. As I was reading it and coming to the end, I was really depressed that it wasn't longer than it was. I could have absolutely read another 600 pages on this. And actually, I ended up buying a first edition of this book because I love it so much, and it's definitely one of my favorite books of all time now. So my second favorite book of the year was The Secret History. My third favorite book of the year was Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I picked this up when it was nominated for the Women's Prize for Fiction long list because even though it was fantasy, and I'm not really a big fantasy reader, I thought it sounded really interesting, and if the Women's Prize for Fiction nominated it, it had to be something special. Then it ended up being shortlisted for the Women's Prize and eventually won. I was so happy that it won the 2021 Women's Prize for Fiction award because it truly deserved it. In my opinion, it was the best book on that list of the ones that I read, and I couldn't be more happy that Susanna Clarke won that award. So this book follows the titular character, Piranesi, and he lives in this house that have infinite rooms. There's Greek statues all along the walls in all these different rooms, and actually the ocean is even in some of these rooms. So like I said, this is a very fantastical place. We learn that Piranesi lives all by himself in solitude except for one other person, and this other person is called the Other. Now Piranesi and the Other don't spend a lot of time together because Piranesi spends most of his week going out and trying to explore the house and trying to figure out the patterns of the ocean and finding more statues, and he goes and visits a lot of the statues in the house. But then once a week, Piranesi always meets with the Other and updates the Other on what he's found and learned about the house so far. Now the Other is pretty distant. He just takes the information that Piranesi gives him and then goes his own way. Now don't be dissuaded from this book if you're not a fantasy reader. I would not call myself a fantasy reader. I have read very, very few fantasy books. This is so much more than a fantasy book. I really can't say too much more than that, but if you know, you know. This is a really interesting book because there's a lot of themes going on under the surface. Also, I read this right after I read House of Leaves, which was super interesting because obviously, like I said, House of Leaves is about a house that's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside. Similar vibes in Piranesi, this house that's just infinite. So if you've read Piranesi and you enjoyed it, I would definitely recommend House of Leaves. And if you've read House of Leaves and you enjoyed it, I would definitely recommend Piranesi. So this was my third favorite book of 2021, Piranesi. Next, my fourth favorite book of the year was Klara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. So in this book, we're in the future that's semi-dystopic, kind of, a little bit, where all children have an artificial friend. So basically like a robot. So every child has an artificial friend, and the artificial friend's point is to keep the child company and to kind of take care of them. It's always a really important choice to choose the artificial friend for the child because this artificial friend is going to accompany this child while they grow up in their life. So the story opens with Klara, and we're from her point of view as she's in a store. She's waiting to be bought to be an artificial friend for a child. So we follow her getting her hopes up day after day that she's finally going to be bought so that she can go home with the child to take care of. Then one day she finally does get bought and she gets to be the artificial friend of Josie. Kind of like Piranesi, Klara and the Sun is also genre defying because yeah, it's kind of science fiction, but it's also a story about humanity because it really makes you question what does it mean to be human. It's very, very profound, and it made me cry at the end. I'll never forget how hard it made me cry at the end, and I think about this book a lot. So this was my fourth favorite book of the year, Klara and the Sun. Next, my fifth favorite book of the year was The Push by Ashley Audrain. Now, I want to really point out that this book is marketed as a thriller, and it is not a thriller. I just want to make sure that that's clear. It's not a thriller, it's definitely just suspense. It's not high action at all, it's just suspense building and building and building. So this book follows Blythe, who just became a new mom to Violet. But as Violet starts to grow up, Blythe becomes convinced that there's something wrong with Violet, that she doesn't seem like a very nice child and she doesn't seem like the average child, that something is wrong. But when Blythe expresses her concern to her husband really just brushes it off and said, "No, I think you're overreacting. There's really nothing wrong with Violet." Violet. So Blythe kind of holds it in and just accepts that that's how Violet is and nothing's wrong. But then Blythe ends up having a second child, Sam. And Sam is exactly the kind of child that Blythe had been expecting when she had Violet. He's loving, cuddly, just the perfect little child. And Violet seems to love him too. But this thought stays in the back of Blythe's mind that something is wrong with Violet. Why doesn't she seem like other kids? I can't say much more than that, but just know that I have never stayed up so late reading a book before. I could not put this down. It was a weeknight and I could not put this book down despite having to get up super early the next morning. I didn't care. I needed to read this book. It was incredible. As soon as I finished reading it, I was Googling if this was going to be adapted because it would be an excellent movie. Now online it did say that the rights were bought, but I just looked again and there's no update on it, but I just think that this would be an excellent movie, so I hope that that's still in motion. So this was my 5th favorite book of the year, The Push. My 6th favorite book of the year is actually a nonfiction, and that's Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer. Now maybe you've heard of Jonathan Safran Foer before because he's written other very famous fiction works like Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close and Everything is Illuminated. So about November last year, I decided that I wanted to start trying to become vegetarian, and of course I wanted to find a book that could educate me more on that choice. After doing some research, I found that this is one of the most recommended books to read if you're thinking about becoming vegetarian. Now I just want to say after reading this, I think that this book should be read by anyone who eats meat, even if you're not considering becoming vegetarian or even vegan. It really examines factory farming and the deplorable living conditions that animals go through in order for us to get our meat. It even talks about the psychological side of eating meat. So for example, Jonathan Safran Foer brings up Thanksgiving. So he says that the Thanksgiving turkey is more sentimental than it is delicious. That we just think about Thanksgiving and we think, oh, we have to have turkey, it's Thanksgiving. Well, not necessarily. Not everybody has to have a turkey at Thanksgiving. He brings up the point that the turkey isn't even the favorite part of the meal for a lot of people. I think it's interesting how he studies the very logistical consequences of eating meat, just like the factory farming and the living conditions of the animals, but also the psychological part of it, about how as a culture we just say that it's normal to eat meat, that we grow up this way and that that's the way that it should be. So like I said, even if you're not considering going vegetarian or vegan, I still think that this is a really interesting book. It's very educational and make you think twice about how we get our meat. So this had to rank pretty high on my favorite books of the year because it was literally life-changing for me. I decided to stop eating meat, and I even bought Jonathan Safran Foer's most recent book, We Are the Weather, which is kind of like a continuation of this one, but it's more focused on the consequences of eating meat on the climate, I think. This was my 6th favorite book of the year, Eating Animals. My 7th favorite book of the year was Lock Every Door by Riley Sager. So this is a thriller that follows Jules. Now Jules has just been hired as an apartment sitter in New York City. The apartment is in this really exclusive building, and Jules really can't believe her luck that she was hired to do this because she's kind of down on her luck that she doesn't have a lot of money, she doesn't have close family, so she thinks that this is perfect for her. However, before she accepts the position, she has to agree to 3 rules: that she can't have visitors, she can't bother the residents, and she can't be away for a night. So Jules thinks, okay, maybe that's a bit weird, but I can't pass this up, I really need this opportunity. And once she moves in, she makes friends with another apartment sitter, Ingrid. But Ingrid kind of insinuates that something's not right with the apartment building and that something weird is going on. Then the next day, Ingrid is missing. So this sets off a whole chain of events of Jules trying to figure out what happened to Ingrid, is something actually weird going on at this place, and everything that follows. Now, I would be very impressed if you would be able to figure out the twist in this book, and even though it's a very shocking twist and surprising, it's not over the top. I've read some thrillers where the twist is literally unbelievable and I just can't stand whatever the twist was because it was so unbelievable. This is a bit far-fetched, but I loved it. It was so well done and very smart. It was just beautifully executed. So I would recommend this for any thriller fans out there. So this was my 7th favorite book, Lock Every Door. My 8th favorite book of the year is kind of a heavy one, and that's My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This book follows Vanessa in 2 timelines. One is in the year 2000 and one is in the year 2017. In the 2000 timeline, Vanessa is 15 years old and she started a relationship with her 42-year-old teacher. And since we read from Vanessa's perspective, we understand the rationalization that she has as a 15-year-old girl that makes her think that this is okay, that this is normal, that she really loves her teacher. His name is Strain. And we can see how Strain is trying to justify that everything is okay to Vanessa through Vanessa's lens, through the filter of a 15-year-old mind. So as a 15-year-old, she doesn't see this as grooming, which it absolutely is. She sees it as, I love him, he loves me. The other timeline is in 2017, and we understand that one of Strain's current students is accusing him of abuse. Now, since the 2000 timeline, Vanessa and Strain have kind of stayed in touch, that Vanessa always has this connection back to him. And so because there's now a legal case against Strain, Strain has contacted her to kind of be a witness for him. And so we see how Vanessa is struggling if she wants to help defend him or not. This book is really powerful and really emotional. It's horrifying to read from Vanessa's point of view because, like I said, we hear her justifying everything that happens and not seeing what's really happening. And so all you want to do is jump in and protect her, but you can't. What's interesting is that the author said that this is kind of her response to Lolita, because if you've ever read Lolita, it's about an older man with a younger girl also. However, in Lolita, we get the older man's perspective. So it's really interesting that Kate Elizabeth Russell flipped that on its head, and now we're getting the perspective of the young girl. So like I said, this is a really heavy read, but really profound and powerful. My Dark Vanessa was my 8th favorite book of the year. So my 9th favorite book of the year is another heavy book, and that's Know My Name by Chanel Miller. So this is an autobiography of Chanel Miller, who was assaulted at university. Once her case went to trial, she wanted to remain anonymous, and for a long time she was just known as Emily Doe. But after her victim impact statement went viral on BuzzFeed, she decided to come forward as Chanel Miller. Hence the title Know My Name, that she wanted people to know that it was Chanel Miller and not Emily Doe who was assaulted, and she wanted people to know her story. So this is her autobiography of everything that led up to the assault and everything that happened after, including the trial. She does an amazing job of examining how women always have to be on alert. She talks about how women can't give their real address on Uber, they have to give an address a few blocks down so that the driver doesn't have their real address. And how if you need help carrying something home, you can't accept help from a stranger because then the stranger will know where you live. And how even if you live close to university, you have to drive rather than walk, because if you walk, you're going to be catcalled. Also, it's so frustrating to read how people tried to protect her assaulter. Basically, they were always saying, yeah, okay, you were attacked, but what about him? His life was ruined. He got kicked out of university. He had such a bright future and you ruined it. Like, what? His future was ruined? And at one point, Chanel talks about how the assaulter's dad testified in court, and he was talking about how his son always got such good grades on his spelling tests. As if that's relevant. I'm gonna read you one of my favorite quotes from the book because I just think it's so powerful. Society thinks we live to come after him, when in fact, we live to live. That's it. He upended that life, and we tried to keep going, but couldn't. Each time a survivor resurfaced, people were quick to say, what does she want? Why did it take her so long? Why now? Why not then? Why not faster? But damage does not stick to deadlines. If she emerges, why don't we ask her how it was possible she lived with that hurt for so long? Ask her who taught her to never uncover it. And I just think that's so powerful and really sums up this book. Know My Name was my 9th favorite book of the year. My 10th favorite book of the year was actually the first graphic novel I ever read, and that's Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is actually an autobiographical graphic novel of the author, and it follows her and her family in Tehran during the Islamic Revolution. It really shows the struggle she had and the difficulties of growing up under a repressive environment. Sometimes this book is taught in schools, which I think is great, and I think it should be. But recently it's been under fire because of some inappropriate language, which I think is ridiculous. We treat high schoolers like they don't know what a bad word is, and I think the importance of this text is more important than a few curse words. Just speaking from my experience, I think there's a big hole in Westerners' education about the Middle East, and I think that this is a great starting point to fill that hole. Like I said, this was the first graphic novel I ever read, and I really was not expecting to be as moved as I was from a graphic novel. But because of how much I love this, I've looked into other graphic novels and I found even more that I loved. There's also a movie adaptation if you're interested as well. My 10th favorite book of the year was Persepolis. My 11th favorite book of the year is another book that I could not read at night, and that's I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. So this book follows our unnamed protagonist who just got in a relationship with Jake. A lot of the story takes place in the car because they're on their way to see Jake's parents so that she can be introduced to them. But during their car ride, she starts to question if she wants to end things, and things go from there. I really can't say more than that because this is a crazy ride. Like I said, I couldn't read this at night because towards the beginning of this book, she's laying in bed trying to go to sleep and she realizes that there's a man outside her window staring at her. So I absolutely cannot read this at night. The suspense of this book just builds and builds and builds, and I have never felt so anxious in my chest from reading a book before. It was physically manifesting in my body how stressed out I was. When I finished this, my mind was just absolutely blown, and for days afterwards I was thinking of other things and piecing the little puzzle pieces together and really appreciating how masterful this story was. This is another one that's going to put you right on the internet after you finish it trying to figure out what other people thought of it. This was my 11th favorite book of the year, I'm Thinking of Ending Things. And finally, my 12th favorite book of the year was Animal by Lisa Taddeo. If you like books like Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney or Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan, you would really like this. So this book follows Joan, who's 37, and the whole theme of the book is really about female rage and trying to get control in your life. It also shows you what 37 years of being a woman can do to someone. The story opens with a man in New York City killing himself right in front of Joan, and this prompts Joan to flee New York and move to California. Now in California, she's looking for a girl named Alice. Now as the reader, we don't know anything about Alice. We don't know who she is, why she's looking for her. Also, some of this book is written in the second person, so it's written directly to the reader. So you did this, or you felt this, for example. And we don't know who she's talking to. Is she talking to us as the reader? Is she talking to somebody else? We have no idea. Now this book is definitely not for everyone, but like I said, if you like Conversations with Friends or Exciting Times, especially Exciting Times, I think you would really like this. I think some people would say that the main character in this is unlikable, but personally I love stories that have unlikable characters, and so if you do too, I think you should give this a shot. My 12th favorite book of the year was Animal. Now this video is already quite long, but I did want to shout out my 13th, 14th, and 15th favorite books of the year, but I won't go too in depth with them. So my 13th favorite book of the year was Exciting Times by Nisha Dolan, so just below Animal, even though they're quite similar. So this follows the main character who becomes an English teacher in Hong Kong. It's very funny and has a love triangle. My 14th favorite book of the year was Madam by Phoebe Wynne. This is a dark academia book where a new teacher is hired at a school that has some dark secrets that she's slowly figuring out. And finally, my 15th favorite book of the year was Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. This is a really interesting study of friendship and relationships, in only the style that Sally Rooney could do. So those were my 15 favorite books of 2021. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope that you got some ideas for a book to read this year in 2022. In the comments below, let me know if you've read any of these books as well, and what did you think of them? If you haven't read any of them, did any of them sound interesting? Which one would you like to pick up? Don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you can see more videos like this one. And I'll talk to you again next time. Bye!